Bishop Sue Hopper Johnson, and we are here to talk about Marjorie Thompson's Soul Feast, Chapter 4, Gathered in the Spirit, Our Common Worship. And we've been looking forward for this week. I want to thank Martha Stokes, my partner in the Virginia Annual Conference, for leading last month's webinar on prayer, and I watched it. Great stuff. I hope all of you, if you've missed some of these, will read the chapter in Soul Feast. The goal is read the chapter, watch the webinar, and then try it for a month. And this month will be worship. We've picked a good month for worship for Advent and Christmas and all that comes of worship in this really great time of year. And now I'm going to turn over to Martha to say hello, and then we'll have our panelists introduce themselves and we'll get started talking about worship. Martha?
Good evening, everybody. It's a joy once again to be with you, and especially, as Bishop Sue's already said, to focus on worship for this month as we work through Advent and toward Christmas. It was a joy last month to talk about prayer, and I hope that is one practice that we don't just do for a month and stop. But
maybe all of them, right?
Especially the prayer part.
Yeah.
So, no, just thanks, and I look forward to this conversation tonight.
Great. Wilma, why don't you go ahead?
Good evening. I'm Wilma Jennings. I'm a lay person. I'm the district lay leader for Shenandoah River District. It's in Market Street, United Methodist Church in Winchester.
Jay, go ahead.
Hey, Virginia Conference. I'm Jay. I'm clergy. I'm currently serving at Charity United Methodist Church, and I'm so thankful to be here with you tonight.
Drew?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Drew Wilson, and I am clergy in the Virginia Conference, and I serve a community called Common Table in Richmond. Great to be with you.
Yeah, Drew also does the heavy lift of working and herding cats for annual conference worship every year. And it's a huge responsibility, but he comes with a wealth of background and information. And at the end, we're going to have Lisa McGee come and join us. She's going to invite the clergy of the annual conference to a special time of spiritual direction. So I'm going to leave that to the end and let her tell us all about that. But worship, let's talk about worship. I was in a church recently and somebody walked up to me and said, I love the chapter on worship. And I've never heard Soren Kierkegaard, the famous theologian's take on worship, that in worship, we are the actors and God is the audience. And so let's talk about that with the panelists, because I think that really, when you take that attitude toward worship, it kind of changes your thinking, I think. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, team, I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, I love the way that she brings that up, and she names the paradox of it, right? That it's both true to say that we are the actors and God is the audience, and also that God is the actor and we are the audience. And I think a really great example is to think about baptism, the sacrament of baptism, where if you're just looking in on it, it looks like we're all doing this thing. We're coming around the font, let's say, we're baptizing the person in question, and we are saying all the words and, dousing with water, all that good stuff. And yet at the same time, everything in that liturgy points to something going on in our midst, that God is on the move, that this is God's graceful act, that this is the means of grace through which God is working. And so for us to think about that we are simultaneously all engaged in this drama, this theatric together, and also we are all there to receive the experience. We're watching Hamilton. We're watching the musical unfold that God is extending into our world.
Right.
I just think of how powerful it is, because I had never heard it that way either. And when we think about God, being the audience, and we think about how we gather every Sunday, whether we're clergy or whether we're lay, no matter what side of that we're on, we're not doing this for each other necessarily, but rather we're really doing it all and really for God. I mean, I just think that just speaks to me so much.
I think it's really important too to know that everybody like you're saying, everybody's involved, and not just the people up front, it's not just the pastors, it's everybody. If you're in the back row, you still need to be involved in service. You're worshiping and your God, everybody's in it together. I like that.
I love that we use the word liturgy, which means the work of the people, all the people. And so if you have like 3 people doing all the work, that worship isn't accomplishing its goal, right?
That's right.
For me, whether I'm helping to lead worship or I'm person sitting in the pew that Sunday, it's recognizing that everything that's happening, whether it's me sitting there in prayer or singing a hymn or offering the words of scripture, whatever it may be, it's all for God's glory. It's not for me. It's not a performance that I'm trying to be a part of or put on. It's for God. And so to recognize that if I'm offering my very best during that time, again, whether I'm sitting in the pew or whether I'm standing at a pulpit or singing from a music stand, that's where the worship connects with my heart. That it's what I'm offering to God of my gifts and graces and talents and love.
Mhm. Well, and I too think when you think about that, God created all of us in so many different ways. I lived in the heart of the worship wars, right? Contemporary versus traditional and all of that. And I had I always thought, well, we always had really excellent guitarists and really excellent drummers and so they should be excluded from the work of the people, right? That there should be a broad and deep participation in the gifts, and that um I I had an organist one time, and he told me without a doubt God appreciates Bach more than country music. I said, well, why did God create us all different? I'm not sure that's valid. And so when we do worship, how do we use the gifts of all the people? And I think my first word would be on the lookout. Who's on the periphery? Who has a gift that you don't know about that um, might be great singer, great instrumentalist, great director, great writer. I love it when children draw worship, art for worship bulletins, that everybody needs to feel like they're a part of it. And I feel like we hijack it when just one clergy and one laity, or sometimes just a couple of clergy, do the whole thing. And it's just not fair. The work needs to be spread out among the people, and to recognize a variety of gifts and a variety. That same organist I had an argument with because he was just beside himself because the local public broadcasting radio station was going out of classical music, and he saw the church as the great preserver of classical music. And I said, yeah, but in our area, country music's by far the most prevalent expression of music. So why don't we have both and, right? I'm always into both and, but why don't we have a more accessible type of worship? I think that's what we've always got to ask ourselves, because we're not, if God is the audience, right, then we need to use all of God's people and all of God's expressions of music and all of God's children involved in speaking the language of God. So I think it's a challenge.
I'd be intrigued to hear how other folks on the panel experience engaging as many people as possible in worship. When I graduated from seminary, I came out having been formed very much in the hope and the training that we would be engaging people in worship planning teams. And so we'd get into the local church, and then we would form these worship planning teams, and everyone would be engaged in planning worship. And I will be honest, it has never worked out. I've been able to engage some people in occasional services, but in terms of sustained planning teams, I failed. Like, I have to tell seminary professors, like I failed the test. That said, that's just one end of worship. That's the planning side of it. And so what I have been able to experience is finding ways in worship to engage more people in creative ways. So, how do you all see that happening, beyond perhaps people coming and treating worship like a spectator sport, right? Like sitting in a chair or a pew and watching things go on. What have you all experienced in terms of engagement?
I'll jump in quickly. I had a wonderful experience starting a contemporary service at church here in Richmond, and um, we weren't able at that point to have an associate pastor or a second pastor who would help to lead that service. So what we ended up doing was having a group of really dedicated laity who decided we could plan these services. We could, base it on the same lectionary text as in the other service we were having, but it would be lay led. And honestly, Drew, it didn't last forever. But for the time that it was needed when we started that service, it was such an amazing experience to have this group of folks who took responsibility, especially as laity, to work with our senior pastor at the time and create this service. And it just felt so authentic. Every service was a little bit different. I do wish that had been an experience that I could have carried forth, you know, for a much longer period of time. But for that time, it was really trying to identify people with the different gifts and graces who could come in and be a part of those services. And it truly was, even for the time period it was living that way, such just a tremendous spiritual growth opportunity for all of us to be able to be to do that and be that. So I would not say you have failed. I would say you have offered the opportunities for those specific times for all of these different people to be a part of that opportunity to plan and participate in worship.
That's beautiful. And now I have no more guilt. Thank you very much.
You're absolved.
One of the things that we've done in worship in a few places where I've served is to make the offering time an opportunity to move around the space. And granted, that can be a complicated task depending on the architecture of your worship space. But that said, where the space has allowed it, for people to be able to move around, to light candles at a prayer candle table, to dip their hands into the waters of the baptismal font to remember their baptism, to write down on prayer cards, or maybe sign up for volunteering or something like that. Like, that's a different level of engagement that has worked for us.
Well, and I think, Drew, one thing that I always enjoyed doing was whenever any Sunday that I would preach, I would have the time immediately after where I would sit down with anybody who wanted to come to talk about, kind of feedback to the sermon, and it also was an easy way for anybody who was new to stick around without feeling like they had to find a Sunday school class, or it was kind of a non-threatening way. And I would always get feedback to see where the worship connected and where it didn't, and to really just hear from them. And then I would always bring the text for the next week and kind of let them play into it without a lot, and I got some great ideas for how they heard the scripture and kind of how we'd approach worship. So sometimes you can even create space for that and not call it the worship committee, but have a way where you invite feedback, you invite dialogue, you invite creativity. And through those groups is where I found folks who really were committed to worship planning and would show up and really be part of that. I also had a lot of success for worship planning for Advent or worship planning for Lent, so that people didn't have to do worship 52 times a year, but they would engage deeply in those special times. So I thought that was helpful. Let's move into one thing I think she really makes a good point about is preparation for worship, and how each of us as Christians have an obligation to prepare for worship, that we don't just show up haphazardly. What were your thoughts on that? I thought that was an interesting insight.
I think that's kind of necessary to get a full experience when you enter the sanctuary or wherever you are. I think if you had some time to pray or just reflect on your week or whatever. Uh, I think it's so much more of an experience for you, for yourself and for others.
Mhm.
I've tried to do that myself somehow, in the car going to church or wherever, and just take some time just to, just center somewhat and not think about, okay, I gotta go to the grocery store later, I gotta, all the things, I try not to go there in my mind and just go, okay, I'm going to worship, I'm gonna focus, and I'm gonna,
Mhm.
worship the best I can.
Right.
And yeah, I think it's very important. One of the things in the past, as a lay leader in the local church, I had a few pastors that would ask me, "Would you spend some time with me before service and just in prayer?" I'm like, "Oh yes, please,"
Yeah.
and that helped me a lot. And I hope it helped the pastor also. But just
Right.
to kind of get us on the same page and maybe can carry that over to the congregation.
Mhm.
One of the things that the author highlights, and I love it a lot, and I'm going to read it. She says, the single most important thing we can do to change our experience of public worship is to revitalize our practice of personal worship.
Mhm.
And I just think about how guilty we all have become and are sometime of faulting in our moments of our personal and our private time with God. How easy is it for, as we say, life to get busy, right? Life happens, and we look up one day and we say to ourselves, "Oh man, I forgot to spend time with God." And when we were talking about, when you think about this, it just kind of brings the life that us keeping in mind that God is the audience, right? God is the audience when we gather, when we worship together, and we keep in mind that worship is not just this thing we can only or should only be doing on Sunday morning, but it's supposed to be a thing that we're supposed to be doing every single day. But how awesome would it be if we all really prepared ourselves Monday through Saturday for when we entered into this sacred place, this holy place, to worship God? Again, how awesome would our public experience of worship be? Again, and that really speaks to me a lot when she says that if we really want to change our public worship, it's got to start with what we're doing outside of the church.
Mhm. Yeah.
Hey, to
Oh,
me, what you just said
I love-
speaks so much to the fact that it's not just the pastor's responsibility
Mm,
for a sermon on Sunday. It's the responsibility of each and every one of us to prepare to hear the words, to have the whole planning of worship speaks to us during the week or after the sermon, not just for that 1 hour. So it puts responsibility back on all of us.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, and I think all of us, I free you to ask your pastor to publish more than a week ahead of time what the scripture will be. Because I think just reflecting on that scripture the entire week is helpful. To pray about it. All of these, all these spiritual practices go together. I remember years ago after I did my Emmaus walk, somebody asked me how it was. I said, you know what? There was no downside to spend 3 days in the presence of Christ. There's no downside. And so to go to worship, there is no downside for that hour. And I can tell you, have I heard bad sermons? Yes. But that's not going to control how I experience that worship service because I've been immersed in the scripture for a week. So, I mean, to be candid, sometimes I've rewritten sermons in my head or thought of different things. But to be in God's presence and to realize that I'm part of a different reality than what I live every day, and that there's a whole different story I'm caught up in. I need that hour at least reminder every week publicly, and that reminder every 30 minutes to an hour every day. So, Jay, I think you're really onto something. The other thing, and I would say if Marjorie asked me what I would add to this chapter about worship, much as God is the audience, I would say that I show up to worship not for me, yes, to a point, but I also show up to serve that community.
mm,
And all of us have weeks when we've had great spiritual weeks and we're on top of the world and things are good, but we also have weeks when we are cut off at the knees or we are grieving or something has pounded us. And let's face it, faith is riddled with doubt and riddled with weeks where we are just not equipped. And so, what if we show up at worship and nobody else is there? So, I have an obligation to show up, to be there for the people who are having crises of faith, to be there for the newcomer. And no amount of watching worship on Zoom is going to make that a community, right? So I'll tell this story because it's profoundly powerful. I went to hospice. I spent the night with a woman whose husband was dying in hospice. I'd never met her because from the moment I got to the church, he'd been ill and they hadn't been in worship. And so I met with her, and she came back to worship a couple weeks later, and I welcomed her, and she became very active in the church, became an officer, you know, a leader in the church. And one day she came to me and she was so excited. I said, "What are you excited about?" She said, "Well, I don't know if you know this, but the first Sunday I came back after my husband died, I was at I had a crisis because I'd never been to worship in my adult life without him. And I was really ready to run and never come back. But a man who was sitting a couple pews behind me came up to me and he said, "Hey, I noticed you were crying through the whole service. Why don't we go over to the fellowship hall and get a coffee and a donut and tell me what's going on?" And she said, "He ministered to me, he encouraged me to come back, and I came back." And then she said, "I'm so excited today because yesterday I was in worship and I noticed a woman in the back row, young woman who cried the whole time. And I knew what to do." She said, "I went up to her after worship. I said, I can tell something's really grieving you and you need somebody to talk to. And I would love to be that person. We can go to the fellowship hall and get coffee and donuts. I'd be glad to hear." And she said, "I knew what to do." So let's not kid ourselves. Worship's not about us getting touchy feelies or being inspired or being spiritually fed. It's a big part of community. And I show up as the body of Christ, as part of the body of Christ, to minister to the body of Christ. And I show up prepared. If the pastor's cold that week and has a boring message, that's not the end of my world because I'm not there. I'm there to tend to the community and I'm there to reflect on my own spiritual connection to God. So let's get this straight because we've got this huge cultural mentality where we come to worship to critique rather than to participate in the divine. So
I appreciate that. And I think we've kind of gotten ourselves into a few cultural binds. I mean, one is that the church, perhaps even for the last 500 or 600 years, has made worship about the word, the word, the word, the word only, as in the words that are shared, and particularly often one person sharing
right.
words. And so what the liturgy sensibility invites us into is to rethink worship as the work of the people, not just the person who is up in
Right.
front. And that is a much richer possibility, a much richer field, a more abundant field for worship to take place and for the means of grace to be extended to us. I think there's a friend of mine who recently referred to worship as as a thermostat instead of a thermometer.
Mm.
That we tend to treat worship as a thermometer, as in, okay, how are people feeling? What's the temperature in the room? We'll follow that. We don't want anyone to be offended. We want to fit in with whatever people are experiencing and meet them exactly where they are. And on one hand, there's a hospitable side of that, meeting people where they are. But on the other hand, there's the prophetic opportunity for worship to meet us with something radically different. I mean, here we are in the season of Advent, waiting for God to meet us in a radically different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think, like, we live in a culture where we can experience worship at home and we can watch TED Talks and we can do all kinds of, we can be entertained at home. And also, I do want to acknowledge Marjorie Thompson does talk in the chapter about people who have to be at home for physical reasons, for health reasons.
Absolutely.
That's really
That's
important.
a whole different ballgame.
It is. That's right. And yet at the same time, like, we are doing something different when we gather as a body, and we are, and it's an opportunity for worship to be a thermostat, setting the culture rather than simply following the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, and too, a worship is a place where I feel compelled to go to the pastor and say, who can I go take worship to? Who can I worship with? How do I embody the gathered body for somebody else. And I think that's, all of us, too often we look to the pastors as the hired hands, and this is the work of the people. So in all phases, how do we make the church the work of the people? I think that's a constant challenge. Let's talk about nostalgia and entrenched forms of worship. And how do we break out of the rut? And how do we speak to different people? It is a form of hospitality, is it not?
Yeah, I was blessed as a teenager to have the opportunity to be in a small choir from high school. And our music director was very intentional about asking those of us that she knew were part of church communities if we might be able to go and sing during one of their worship services. So, as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, I had this great opportunity to be in different places,
Mm.
different styles of worship, different faith traditions. And from that moment on, I have welcomed the opportunity to experience something new, whether, it's a new style of prayer, a new style of song, just a new flow of the worship service. And I think when I think of nostalgia, Bishop Sue, I think of getting stuck in a rut
Yeah, yeah.
of, doing the same thing Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And that fear that so many people have of even the slightest little change
Mm.
in that worship format. But what a tremendous growth opportunity and blessing it's been for me across my faith journey to be in different spaces and with people of different backgrounds and cultures than my own, and to be able to experience God in a different way.
Mhm.
And so, that whole feeling of nostalgia, yes, is important, especially in traditional times like Christmas. Uh, but yet, there are so many ways to worship that I still have never had the opportunity to take part in. And I think if we're reaching into a world that is so very diverse these days, that we have to be open to those
Mhm.
experiences.
Both and, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me wish that our nostalgia could be for the God who does a new thing,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
That our nostalgia could be, oh, remember that time that I experienced this thing and what a formative experience that was. So
Mhm.
that's fine. Like that's faithful. That's
Yeah,
good, right? I
right.
mean, we are a
Right.
people who remember an ancient story as who we are, right? And can we also summon the courage to say, our nostalgia recalls the God who did a new thing, and therefore I come expecting a new thing. That's
Mhm.
the God that I love. Like
Right.
that would be a great approach to worship.
Mhm.
Both and.
Well, and I think an essential quality of worship is to come expectant that God will speak in a new way, expectant that something will break through. And if you're just doing it out of obligation and rote, it's hard for wonder to break in. I was just I'm doing an Advent devotional, and Scott Erickson, who's going to be with us at annual conference next year, said that the danger of nostalgia is you lose wonder because you're so entrapped with what you've always done, you fail to see it with new eyes. And I think, I love nostalgia. But sometimes it helps to cut loose. And
Mhm.
I will say, when I think back to the most profound worship experiences that I've had, they have been the most alien to me, like an Orthodox Jewish service or a Hiawassee Mountain Fair Mountain Revival, uh, because it caught me so off guard and I heard it in a new way. So I would say, um, create some new opportunities for your congregation. Have something new in worship every week, but then have some profoundly different worship services to help people meet God in a new way. Other thoughts on that?
No, I'll just mention that I was kind of quiet because, when I think about worship and nostalgia, the thought of that, I think that in a world that is forever changing, There's a really vast majority of people who find themselves worshiping, and they think to themselves that I need this one thing to
Right.
remain the same. Because when this has changed, I just need this one thing
Right.
to remain the same. And I think it's a very interesting, like we are in Advent, right? A very, interesting place of tension to kind of be at. And I almost would love to hear some more thoughts on what it looks like to invite those people who it's not as if they fear or they don't want to worship differently, but rather it's that this world is forever changing, and I feel almost displaced when things in
Yeah.
worship are different. What would you offer to
Right.
that set of people?
Well, I know, having fought the worship wars in numerous churches, all we had to do in any given church is say these magical words: we will always have a traditional worship service as you've known it here. And that got rid of a lot of fear. And then we would have different worship services. And funny, those people started wandering into those different worship services. But it was a permission. It's not, you're wrong or we're going to hit you over the head, but it's try this. And we found people who would go to services with their grandchildren and realize, oh, I enjoy this. There's something I'm getting from this, or I enjoy watching my grandkids lit up, right? So I think that yeah, the never it's both and have many. Have it, this is a cafeteria, not a order one entree kind of thing. And I would say, in any worship service, have one element of surprise, but have some stuff that you can anchor into. Um, or if you want to try a whole new, I just think that part of it is, and I've noticed this with my daughter, people don't sit and listen to people speak I mean, when people tell me they still preach 45 minutes, I cringe, because I know even I can't have a hard time sitting through a 3-hour movie that I sat through 20 years ago. That's just not how we take in information. And so why don't we have more dialogue sermons? Why don't we have, or, is the sermon, how do we have ways that communicate with people? Because, I still laugh. My old mentor, he would stand up and go, when I was a student at Vanderbilt University, and it was this old preacher style, that's gone, right? So how do we, to stop there is foolishness. The whole world is, and I think TED Talks have been good for worship, right? If you can't get something out in 18 minutes clear, preaching is about in and out direct. So um I think we got a lot to learn, and it's to our detriment if we don't pay attention to that.
Now, I love Jay, to your point, and let me just say, you are so right on about nostalgia and worship being a place where people desire. Please just don't change this. Everything else is changing. Please give me the space. That is
Right.
beautifully put and right on. I love the thought that, like, in 1779, there's this church, and the music leader goes, all right, we have a new song that has just been published, and we're going to sing it here. And now I know there's sensitivity about new songs, but I want us to try this out. And they sing this new song, and some people walk out of the sanctuary going, oh, that was really nice. That was nice. And other people go, I hate that new hymn, Amazing Grace. Like, there
Yeah.
was a point when
Right.
churches sang that for the first time, and surely someone just couldn't stand it, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, to your point, I think one of the things that we can do, and Bishop Sue, to your point as well, we'll always have traditional worship, right? To be able to offer to people clarity around what we do, what we are committed to, right? Like, hey, y'all, we're always going to be a sacramental church. We will continue to celebrate Holy Communion and baptism. Or,
Right.
friends, we will always fill in the blank. Like, we'll always be doing this song, or we'll always be doing whatever. We will always pray the Lord's Prayer. I mean, I think that can help people just establish some firm ground so that they can also keep moving forward.
I'll make this point too. When you were talking, it kind of I thought about though the moments in worship that we feel as if these changes are getting the best of us, I wonder, have we prepared ourselves, right? It makes my mind go back to
Yeah.
wonder, am I preparing myself for something new, right? The God of newness. Am I preparing myself for something new? Am I expecting this awesome thing to take place, or rather, am I expecting, or am I, attending worship because this is just what I think I'm supposed to be doing? And so I think it goes back to a little bit of how have we prepared ourselves? How have we made, this our internal dwelling place, a place where God has dwelled with us, all week long. That when we get to worship, it's not just a here I am again, but rather it is God, I'm wanting something and I want you almost new again. So yeah, it's awesome.
Well, my prayer is when I'm 80 years old, which is just getting all too soon, it's like in the horizon now, um, that I'm in a worship service and it's filled with young people and I hate every moment of it. That's my prayer, right? I don't get this. I want my way. I don't get that, right? I don't want to be an 80-year-old alone with my worship like done exactly like I want it. I don't understand that. And I think that's a symptom of loss of mission. You've
Mm.
forgotten who you are and what you're about.
I think that's a powerful point, especially in a lot of our congregations. We find that we are on the brim of needing to grow, but rather us making space and creating that safe space for people who don't look like us, talk like us, or even in the same tax bracket, or or grew up like us. We don't make the space for them to be able or to feel comfortable in worshiping. And I just, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I haven't prayed that prayer yet, Bishop.
Well, you're too
Uh,
young.
yeah,
You will someday. I hope.
I hope so too.
Oh, man.
I think worship should be a reflection of the kingdom. Everybody, everybody.
Mhm.
If you're not included, then something's wrong. And I don't think there's a line in all the this denomination here, all this denomination there, and if you're this tall, stand here, and I don't think there are lines like that. So, I think that was something that I never thought of as happening. That there's division in the
Mhm.
kingdom. So, one of the things I spoke about before was just including just experiences like anything that you did before. Like I was talking about when I was teaching, and I had to learn sign language really quick because I had a student who's deaf. And I know that in my congregation there are 40 people who are deaf. There might be some hard of hearing, but most of them didn't know sign language. But I could use ASL as part of the worship, and it brought people in. They questioned what was I doing, what are these signs, and then they got really specific on what did that mean, what did that sign mean, and then I could talk about that sign, saying it means to hurry, hurry, don't be patient and wait and squander your time doing something else. You need to focus in and kind of get with the program. That's what that
Mhm.
sign means. So in a song like What Child Is This, which is one that sang this past Sunday, um, it was haste,
Mm.
hurry, hurry. And the pastor kind of brought that out in her sermon. So I brought it out in my interpretation and sign. And it seemed to connect with the people.
Mm.
And it helped a lot to, get people more enthusiastic about, okay, this is happening,
Mm.
let's get more involved, let's get, more focused. And that's the kind of thing that I think that, everybody brings something like that.
Mhm.
And so if you keep it, keep your mind open and your heart open, that the kingdom is everybody, then you can find people who can do things like that to enhance the service and,
Right.
bring everybody to worship.
Wilma, I love that. I just want to highlight a line from the book because what you just said reminded me. Marjorie Thompson asked the question, does the worship you plan take account of the fact that we are embodied creatures?
Mm.
And I don't know, but I can imagine that, Wilma, when you were up there signing haste, haste, it just, it immediately connects with people and reminds them we're embodied. Like we are physical creatures, and you're showing that and reminding people, and what a gorgeous reminder that is. And just what an encouragement for us to think about. All right, in worship, we gather as a body. How are we employing our bodies?
Mhm.
Right. Thank you.
Too, for me, Drew, a part of that embodiment is emotion. And so I fear that a lot of times we are so afraid of showing our emotion
Mm.
in worship, whether it's the joy or whether it's the tears, whatever it may be. And you sometimes, you look out on a congregation and you wonder if there's really peace and joy
Yeah.
in their lives.
Where's the joy? Show me some joy, right?
Yeah, I've said for years on Pentecost Sunday when leading, every time I feel the Spirit, that I wanted everybody to at least look happy, looking back at me as we sang. And so, a part of the embodiment for me as you talk is also how we experience and share our emotions with the connections.
Well, and I think good worship planning um, pays careful attention to mood, right? What's the mood of the text? There are Sundays for lament, there are Sundays for breathtaking joy, there are Sundays for deep reflection. And that helps. And paying attention to the senses, paying attention. I still think of some of my best, the most fun I've had with worship was I had two women who were very artistic, and we would go for the Holy Thursday and the Good Friday service and spend hours playing with light and shadow in the sanctuary. That to me is very compelling. And I'd always be a detective, right? When I went to a house and there was this just unbelievable Christmas tree, and I asked the host who did this, she said, my daughter just retired and moved down, and this is what she does. And I talked to her, and she ended up being very active in the church and had been a florist in DC. And I still remember Marilyn sitting in the hallway behind the sanctuary, and she would go the flower market early in the morning and just sit in the back and do these amazing arrangements in about 5 minutes. It was truly remarkable. She did flower garlands. I've talked with y'all earlier about a guy who played the saw on Holy Thursday. I've never seen anybody play the saw, but if you want a really effective mood for worship on Holy Thursday, get somebody to play the saw. Um, just and it became a community event. I know that our worship team, we wanted really interesting flowers for Easter, and we got tired of just the pots of Easter lilies. It was just boring, right? Nobody had thought about that in 50 years. So I found a florist, and Dan I knew was gifted, and he goes, what do you want me to do? I said, I want to see resurrection. I want to see resurrection. And he took forsythia and these huge tall and it was interesting because a woman came up to me after the worship service and she said, my 8th grader looked at those floral arrangements and said, that's resurrection, Mom. So, and then we had, one Advent, we talked about reflection and how we're to reflect Christ. And so on Christmas Eve, we had all sorts of mirrors. And the party, if you want great worship, get to know the person who owns the party rental store in town. Because we went to Dawn and said, boy, do you have any mirrors? She's like, I did a wedding with like 200 mirrors and they're just sitting in my warehouse. So Dawn, not a member of our church, but a very spiritually deep person, ended up being on our worship team, and she had the party stores like, come pick what we need. So this is a way we gather, right? This is how we incorporate, this is how we encourage people. And what better way to look for musicians and artists and gifts and ideas and creativity. And boy, the whole children's realm, I'm terrible with children, but boy, you get 4 or 5 people who can light up children. What a great part of worship. So I just say be creative and be permission giving, right? I love congregations that are permission giving. Try it. Let's see, Hey, Drew, why don't we turn to like the fourfold path of worship and kind of what we'd like to see in the basics of worship as we think about that, and how worship models the story, right? That we're to model the reign of God and the kingdom of heaven for that hour. So we
Mhm.
live like we're in it. How does that play into all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things I hope people can hear like right now is the best resources are already in your in
Right.
your reach.
In your
United
community.
Methodist Hymnal has
Yeah.
a fantastic introduction to worship in it, and the fourfold pattern of worship, which actually I've sort of shifted around a little bit, but basically gather, hearing, responding, and then the hymnal says thanksgiving, communion, and then sending forth, right?
Yeah.
I tend to think of like gathering, hearing, responding, sending,
Right.
and
So
thinking
do I.
about communion as a response, offering as a response, all that. But yeah, but that we do that also as a way of reflecting, like you were saying,
Mhm.
the salvation story that we are gathered as God's people. That I mean, think about Sinai, think about in the wilderness, right? The Israelites are gathered, they are given the law. That's the hearing, the receiving, like that. And then the response is making the covenant and saying, yes, we will do this. This is going to be who we are. And then gradually people are sent out into the world to be a
Mhm.
blessing, right? I'm mixing some stories, but you get the idea.
Sure.
So just to approach worship that way, in this fourfold way, and go figure, like it's actually a really great way of thinking about any kind of human gathering, to think
Mhm.
about this fourfold experience. I've planned other events going, all right, let's think fourfold. And there's a real fullness, a richness to coming together, to receiving something together, to being experiencing a transformation in that, and then to sending people forth into the world
Mhm.
transformed by
Mhm.
it.
And that, every aspect of our worship models one aspect of the Christian life. We gather, um, we pass the peace. Boy, if you want to annoy me in worship, say greet your neighbor, because the tradition that you pass the peace, that we are reflecting a peace and a unity beyond what we can do or imagine. And we're living into that moment. We're living into a moment of radical offering where we not only offer our gifts, but we offer ourselves as a holy and living sacrifice. We come together as a people, forgiven but repentant, right? We confess of our sins, and then we come to the table, really supposed to leave any kind of division behind us, or we go and repair it before we come to the table again. So all of this is a foretaste, right? A foretaste of the final banquet, a foretaste of when God lives among us, a foretaste of when we are all united. And worship should be a glimpse and a reminder at the same time. It's memory and living into it. So we're sent forth prepared for what we find in the world, and really to create this kind of alternate reality in our homes and our workplaces, so that the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God, moves outward through us. It's a beautiful thing. So just, to think of it as an hour where we come and we complain about worship, and we, or we half pay attention during a Zoom call, really messes with that whole depth of understanding.
Yeah, I think about is it Second Corinthians where Paul says, God has reconciled us to God through Christ, and then has given us the ministry of reconciliation.
Mhm.
And that in worship, as we gather as a reconciled body, like we pray a prayer of confession, and and then we share the peace, right? That's our practice of reconciliation.
Right.
Here we are reconciled. And then the practice of Holy Communion. Like this is us living this thing out. This is us practicing what it means to be a reconciled, forgiven, transformed people. And then go out and live like that. Like
Right.
practice these table manners everywhere you go. So
Right.
worship is like we keep exercising these muscles. We keep on doing this so that we can be this kind of people in the
Well, and
world.
even more than that, we're empowered, right? That we can't do this alone, that we receive the Holy Spirit. And that's what enables us to do this and to seek out others and to live as reconcilers. And I think we've got to restore depth to worship and a real understanding of who we are. That's what all these spiritual practices are about, the deep connection to God required to do any of this stuff. And when it's diminished or when it's petty, or when it's critiquing, it flies in the face of all who we are. So um, I would say, as a person who's planned worship and done worship for a living my whole life, it's really hard to check the critique at the door. But I think I've gotten pretty good at it because I'm not there to critique what they're doing, because I'm really not the audience and they shouldn't really care what I think, right? So
This
One of the things.
conversation, I'm
Okay.
sorry, Jay.
No, go
I
ahead.
think this conversation relates directly to one of the questions we've gotten, and that's how do we have worship that truly feels relevant in a time when the world is so divided?
mhm.
And what it has made me think about, Drew and Bishop Sue, is how much of a teaching time we might need in worship, as well as to, for those
Right.
of us, especially as we think about nostalgia and tradition, who care so much about that, but yet we may not remember or we may not know what the purpose of some of those movements of worship are to be about,
Yeah.
what the call really is.
Right. Well, the last thing I'll say, and then we got to leave time for Lisa to give her invitation. But I do think part of the anemic nature of our worship is we're used to what we're used to, right? The most frustrating assignment I ever had was being assigned to lead the worship committee at the big church one of the big churches I served. And I realized that these folks had never seen another worship service but the ones they were in, right? Most of them have been going there for decades. And so um, I immediately said, we got to take some field trips. So I would suggest, your worship team, or even if you're just somebody interested in helping worship be better at your church, go to a synagogue, go to an African American church, go to different churches and expressions, go see how it's done. I had the gift in seminary, I didn't have a church. And every week in Atlanta, it was like I was a kid in a candy store and I saw every kind of worship imaginable. And it really informed me for the future. So do some field trips, go talk about it, go see what possibilities there are. And if you're a small church, go to some other small churches, because it's easier. I will say this, I thought it was easier to do worship in smaller churches than the large church, because you have years of relationship, you know each other, it can be intimate, you can do things in a small congregation you can't do in a large congregation. So I would say be inquisitive, explore, and move beyond nostalgia and routine and see what God can do in your midst. Other closing thoughts?
My only closing thought is when you all were talking about that a while ago, for me, I almost feel like my worship and witness kind of go hand in hand.
Mhm.
And at the end of worship, I feel like the Holy Spirit's leading me to say, if people are going to find Christ this week, my prayer is that they find Christ in and through us. And
Mhm.
that just kind of spoke to what you all were kind of saying a while ago, because I think that's just so true. If they're going to find Jesus, when people talk about, Pastor, when our church to grow, we want more people here, and I tell them all the time, well, it's through our relationships, it's through us bringing people inside, it's through us, what happens here, getting our energy, and we're going out and finding people. And if they're going to find Jesus Christ, it's my prayer that they find Jesus in us.
Yeah.
Jay, there's a benediction from the Corrymeela community, and it goes, may you see the face of Christ in everyone you meet, and may everyone you meet see the face of Christ in you.
Nice. Boy, it'd change the world, wouldn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. Lisa, are you around? It's your turn. Thanks for waiting for us.
Oh, you're so welcome. Gosh, this was such rich conversation. I thank each of you. And there were so many things that you said that I think relate to spiritual direction. So this is a byproduct of this book and this study and webinar. A group of spiritual directors in the conference have gotten together for prayer and discernment, and are really feeling led to offer group spiritual direction to our clergy. We're going to start there. My hope is that we will offer it to laity in the future. And Bishop, one thing that you said was that this is a time where we may feel that we've been cut off at our knees. And I think, and Martha, you talked about division and tension. And I imagine this is something that many, if not most, or all of our clergy are feeling. These are difficult, challenging times, but they're also times of great hope. And so, one way that you can reconnect is, and I think reconnect with God, is through group spiritual direction. So, group spiritual direction is where you companion together, you listen. This is not group therapy. We're not trying to fix anything, but it's where you can sit with others and just listen to where God is acting in your life, where God is walking with you. So our hope is that in the first of the year, we will offer a variety of opportunities, times, length of times for groups of 6 to 8 to come together and journey together during a season. So the invitation is that if you are a spiritual director and if you're interested, contact me or Scott Hopkins, and we'll get that information out. And if you're interested in participating in a group, let us know. We'll be sending information out the first of the year, but we really appreciate this opportunity to extend this invitation.
Thank you, Lisa. I tell you, I can't say enough about spiritual direction. I love my spiritual director. And we'll be having a whole chapter on that in Soul Feast in the
Yes,
month
we
to come,
will.
and Lisa will be back.
Yes.
So but clergy, we hear you, we know it, and if you don't have anything to give, it is devastating to your congregation. So I hope that you will be watching for this announcement and you'll sign up. Those of you who are laity, will be getting to spiritual directors, and this is something that's available to you too, and we'll be providing resources for you along the way. But as for worship, I challenge you to put more time into planning worship, put more time into preparing worship, put more time into including more people in worship, and really have some discussions about how do we make scripture come alive and do the work of the people in response to it. So thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you for being part of this. By all means, send me your thoughts at bishop@vaumc.org, and we will see you. What's the next month, Martha? You'd think I'd look ahead.
It's reclaiming Sabbath time. So
Yeah,
what a
I knew
great way to
that, but
start the new year.
January, what's the date? Anybody know? First Monday in January is coming.
The 6th.
Epiphany. So we will have an Epiphany on January 6th and talk about Sabbath, and that is a critical piece of this. So blessings, have a blessed Advent and a tremendous Christmas. I hope your worship is vibrant. I hope that you will embody Christ and that we will all celebrate incarnation well. Good night, and thank you all. I appreciate it.